I'm not expecting you to answer me. I'm Gary Miles. I've spoken to you at the boardroom or on the mop-up meeting that we had, which was online as well, and talked about where you were likely to be or were hopefully going to be by this point. The purpose of the presentation today is just to talk about some of the syllabus areas that we have coming up. So for the remainder, some of you might have already looked at them and had a go at some of the material already. But what I'm going to do first is probably just have a bit of a recap, thinking about have you found any issues so far in your studies, or did you have any questions regarding the material in terms of content? That would be quite useful. I had a look on the discussion forum just this morning, a few minutes ago, and see if there's nobody's actually raised any questions or queries on there. So I'm assuming that means that everything's okay. If you do have any issues about accessing the CIA PwC hub, which is on the IIA's learning site, then they need to be directed towards Jan and his team, and they'll fix them pretty quickly. So hopefully so far the material has been okay and you've understood it. We're going to have a quick look at some of the key components of sections 1 and 2, as I say on the slide that's on your screen at the moment, and then some of the things that you will be looking at in section 3, and any challenges ahead, I suppose. Any questions, as Jan said, please type them up, and if you can't access that Q&A functionality then on the WebEx, then please email or text Jan, and I'm sure he'll raise them as we go. One of the bullets that I didn't cover was on schedule ? So hopefully you are so far. You still have time to catch up ahead of the revision workshop, and at the end I'm just going to summarise some of the things that we're going to be doing at the revision workshop in January, and a little bit about the Q&A as well. I'm sure it's already in your calendars that on the 10th and 11th of January you're doing the revision workshop, and then on the 12th you are doing some work, and then I'm going to come in and we're going to spend some time just any final questions and concerns, and then it's away for the exam. So I'm not sure how long this will take. I've got about 20 slides, so hopefully we'll cover everything you need, and if there's any questions at the end or any questions throughout, we can pick those up as we go. So far you've covered section 1, mandatory guidance. The 3 chapters that are covered within the book and the syllabus are, as shown on the screen: definition of internal auditing, code of ethics, international standards. Pretty much the definitions is very likely to come up in some form in terms of questions, so very, very important area. Code of ethics, the 4 elements of the code of ethics: integrity, objectivity, confidentiality and competency, as well as what each of those mean and what they mean for internal audit specifically rather than general definitions. And then underlying those there are a number of core principles, elements that are extremely examinable because they fit into a nice pattern of 3 or 4 items for each of the 4 elements of the code of ethics. So that's certainly something to read and digest ahead of the exam. And then the standards, and as you will have seen and you'll all know, there are 4 attribute standards and 7 performance standards, all of which are very, very important, particularly for part 1 are the attribute standards, and the material that you've worked through, you'll have looked at each of those 4, and will hopefully have a real good grasp of what's covered, what's involved, and some of the wording that is used in the International Professional Practice Framework, because that's the wording that the examiners will use as they go forward. And also it's something that hopefully, if there are areas that you have wanted further information on, that you've had a chance to look at some of the implementation guides. Very important section, this one, for the exam, 35 to 45% of all the questions, and at proficiency level. And we talked about what the different levels were as far as proficiency and awareness. and I'm just trying to move forward. Oh yeah, let me just check I haven't skipped a slide there because I was getting a bit heavy with the finger. Yeah. So here's your the new and now examinable International Professional Practice Framework. You have the mission of internal auditing. I could quote you it, but you'd just think I was reading off a piece of paper. But certainly at the at the revision workshop, I like to check to make sure that you have learned some of the core and key definitions. So mission's definitely one. It's a one-liner: to enhance and protect organisational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice and insight. So it's important to know that, and it's important to know what each of those elements mean. Because this became examinable in July 2017, it's very likely that there will be questions in your exam around the mission, which is a new element, and also around the 10 core principles, which again is a new element that was introduced last January, but 6 months later it becomes examinable, and therefore there's a good chance there'll be elements of the core principles that are in place. Some of them are 2 and 3 words, so the first one is demonstrate integrity. Some of them are slightly longer, but usually just one line. So certainly something to have a read through a few times to get the understanding of the wording, I think, is probably the best approach for those. Then the 3 elements that I've mentioned: the definition, the standards and the code of ethics, and the implementation guidance. And basically implementation guidance, and that there is one for each of the standards at least, and some for some of the underpinning standards. So for example, if I gave you managing the internal audit activity, which is Performance Standard 2000, there is an implementation guide that tells you a little bit more about what that means for chief audit executives, which is the phrase we use for internationally for the head of internal audit, and also within there, underneath managing the internal audit activity, which is Performance Standard 2000, as I said. That, for example, 2050 talks about coordination and reliance, and there's an implementation guide that talks about that. So if there are elements of some of the, particularly the attribute standards, 1000 to 1100, etc., that you think I'd like a little bit more on that, because just in case you thought there wasn't enough in the book, that's a joke, but yeah, okay. Then it's something that you can read as well. It's not required, but certainly the terminology that is used by IIA Global in some of those implementation guides can be helpful when deciphering or dissecting the questions that you get asked. And you'll have seen a number of questions because you'll have been practicing some of the questions that are on the learning site, and some of the terminology there might be a little bit unclear, or you might find it not particularly familiar or unfamiliar, I suppose is the English word I'm looking for. And you'll see that the terminology generally tends to be drawn from the implementation guides or the standards themselves. So it's quite useful to have a look at some of those. Supplemental guidance is what we used to call practice guides, and there are a small number of those that pick up elements of how different sectors work, and really for interest, not particularly as important for the exam. But if you are, for example, auditing in an area, projects or external business relationships, for example, you'll find that there are some supplemental guides that take you through what others have done in other industries, and sometimes I'm sure PwC have some on there around financial services, for example. So useful to have a look through those. But that's more of a practical post-exam celebration read rather than essential reading for passing the exam. So I move on. So we looked at the first section 1, and you looked at section 2 as well. And you'll remember in the presentation that I did at the PwC site at Embankment, as well as on the Mop-Up WebEx, we talked about a number of these in terms of different frameworks, types of controls, the risk vocabulary, and we talked about the definition of risk, what definition of risk management, and looked at a couple of models around enterprise-wide risk management and what you might need to know on those. For example, the 8 components of the COSO enterprise-wide risk management model that are the front face of the cube, understanding what each of those means from a perspective of the IIA. So if I picked out, for example, risk response, which is about just below halfway on those out of the 8, we know that there are 4 risk responses that the IIA advocate, and they are share, accept, avoid, reduce. And you will know by now, because this is just what each of those means, and if you don't, you will by the revision workshop. And some of the other concepts, and we talked about the ISO 31000 model and the different terminology and what they mean and how they manage risk, etc. And then what are the roles, the key roles of significant factions or functions within the organisation, such as the board, the audit committee, senior managers, chief risk officer, in terms of risk management and enterprise-wide risk management. And then there are 3 categories of roles that the IIA highlight in terms of what internal audit should be doing around risk management. One of those sections are legitimate roles that internal audit can undertake. One is legitimate roles with safeguards, and one covers roles that internal audit should not undertake. So the first 2, basically, the first section, our legitimate roles, talks about the assurance work that we'll do. The legitimate roles with appropriate safeguards talks about consulting activity, and the roles we shouldn't do are things like setting risk appetite and doing risk management for the organisation. So the first section, section 1 about mandatory guidance, was 35 to 40%, my apologies. This section covers 25 to 35, but these are at awareness level. So this is an understanding of what each of the elements are, and then to answer questions based on that understanding. So that's where we are, and I think I've put the COSO's Internal Control Integrated Framework, and there it is. There are actually 5 elements, because the information and communication are linked, but starts with our control environment, which is talking about management's operating style and philosophy, integrity and ethics, the organisational structure, assignment of levels of authority and responsibility, etc. Risk assessment covers the range of, or the flow of your risk management process, which is risk identification, risk analysis or measurement, risk evaluation based on where that risk sits following with an appreciation of risk appetite, is it acceptable or not, and then we move on to the response and how we do that, and maybe if we're reducing it, we put control activities in, monitoring system, and then we get information at each level, and we communicate out at each level. So really there could be an arrow in from right to left of the screen where information is required at each level to understand where we are, and then communication out or reporting out to each of the different levels in the organisation. So that was one of the control models that we looked at, and there are other control models in your textbook. Interestingly, I had a student recently who told me that they had a question in part 1 on COBIT, which any IT auditors or those who are interested in IT out there will know stands for for control objectives in information-related technology. It is one of the 6 recognised control frameworks from IIA Global, so it's examinable in a sense. It isn't particularly covered in your book, but I will cover in the revision workshop the 5 stages of COBIT, which is all you'll need to be able to answer a question, certainly in part 1 on that. As with each of the exams, there is a real strong link, so I'll probably say this several times at the revision workshop. So this isn't one of those exams where you study, you learn, and then you can forget, because the knowledge that you learn for part 1 and part 2 will certainly help you when you come to doing part 3, which is a 100 question exam in 2.5 hours. But if you think there's a lot to read in part 1 with the book, I'll encourage you by saying that there are 3 books for part 3. So that's something to look forward to already. Anyway, back to this. So that's one of our control frameworks, and there's the COSO model with the 8 on the front, the 8 components, COSO calls them, on the front, the 4 objectives along the top of what your enterprise-wide risk management system is trying to achieve, and the 4 levels of the organisation, so entity level, division, business unit, and then subsidiary. You might not, as an organisation, have subsidiaries, so it could be supplier, it could be another category, another layer in the organisation, but that one's quite flexible from the COSO perspective. I'm using the COSO acronym because I know that you'll all know that that stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations from the Treadway Commission, which was set up in 1992 in response to some of the financial services and financial sector problems that we had globally, and it's something that the IAA are particularly interested in because they sit as representatives on the board of the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations of COSO, so that's why we talk about COSO quite a bit. And here are the roles that I was talking about before in terms of internal audit and ERM. So those on the left, the core internal audit roles in regard to ERM, that's really our assurance approach. So the audits where we'll provide an opinion over some of those areas. Those in the middle, legitimate roles with safeguards, they are really our consulting activities that we can do. And on the right, the ones we shouldn't undertake. And I mentioned setting risk appetite and being responsible for risk management as you go. I would recommend very strongly that you learn those because there have been numerous questions come up in previous exams. And each of your exams will be different because they're drawn from a bank of 800 questions, but it would be particularly useful and interesting for you to learn those. Particularly, it's a fantastic party trick which only really works at my revision workshop. Don't try it at the weekend. So that's our first 2 sections done, and I'm quite happy with those. I'm not going to pause here. We won't be here for 2 hours unless I'm hoping that the fact that there's no questions so far, I can't see any questions so far anyway, means that all of those things are very familiar to you, and you've done as much as you need to do to understand all of those concepts. So even though I'm an internal auditor, I like to think I'm positive. So that's my approach, rather than that's the first time that I've ever seen any of those, which I'm sure isn't the case. Okay, so don't forget you can ask questions at any time if you have any, and I shall continue. Section 3. So we haven't looked at this yet. We haven't talked about it yet. This is a really quite a practical section of the exam. Talks about a lot of the things that you do as part of field work or testing approaches, documentation. Has a big focus actually, and quite a lot of material in the books, in the textbook that you have. Talks about some of the approaches around data gathering, process mapping. We talk about Part B, which, as you will know from that, are some of the elements of evidence, so that's quite a short section. Data analysis and interpretation we're going to look at, and that's where we've got things like sensitivity analysis, simulation. We have financial ratios, so any accountants out there will be delighted to know that all of that work you did learning your profitability ratios, your debt ratios, etc., will come in handy, very handy for this exam. And those non-accountants over there, this gives you an introduction to some of the types of questions you'll get throughout parts 1, 2 and 3, exams 1, 2 and 3 I'm talking about, because financial ratios is a familiar and recurring theme. Documentation and work papers, very nice one. What are some of the key requirements? And there can be some nice straightforward questions on those. And then data reporting, and really that's not talking about your final report. We get into that a little bit more in CIA Part 2. or you will. But data reporting, and this is about putting summary findings together. So if you've done a testing approach or a test strategy, how do I report those findings to my senior auditor, my audit manager, so I can think about my evaluations and my opinions around what I've tested, what I've found. Are there any recommendations required? So we talk a little bit about those as well as we go. Is Section 3 at awareness or proficiency level? Excellent question. Thank you, Hannah. That proves that at least one person's listening, which is even better. And think, if I remember rightly, it's at a mix. But as I'm going through and rambling and making it look like I know everything about everything, I'll find out and I'll let you know at the end. So it's a really good question. Okay. Let me move on. Okay, so the first part on data gathering and process mapping, very much what I've done really with the slides, and as I say, there aren't a huge number of slides. I've just put down what the syllabus says, and then we can talk through some of the key bits and what will be picked up. So the first part is really about what you might do, for example, as part of your preliminary survey. And in practical terms, when you're doing your audit work, you won't do as many of these different approaches. You won't do as many as as are here, and that's not really what the syllabus and the exam are actually saying. What they're trying to say is more, these are a range of some of the options that you will pick up. And just to answer your question and why I'm kind of a little bit, they're all at proficiency level. Okay. Sorry, I've just lost my... So, yeah, they're all, Section 3, all at proficiency level. So the only, basically, Part 1 and Part 3 of this exam are Section 1 and Section 3 are proficiency, and Section 2 is awareness. So reviewing previous audit reports and other relevant documentation. So for example, that could be things like minutes of meetings. You would hope that, bear in mind we do risk-based internal auditing, that you would look at risk register, for example, as well. And then it talks about develop checklists and internal control questionnaires as part of the preliminary survey. Checklists are, you know, have I got all of the documentations, or it might be something where we might send to the manager of the function or the client auditee and ask, you know, do you have these documents available? So if, you know, are there policies and procedures? And if the answer comes back no, we've probably got a recommendation before we even leave the office. Internal control questionnaires are quite interesting. When I did my training, which was quite a long time ago now, around about the year 2000, internal control questionnaires were the big thing, and were quite were in widespread use. I was going to say trendy, but I'm not sure that's the right word. The widespread use, shall we say. The limitations of an internal control questionnaire were that they were basically designed to ascertain a yes or a no answer. And then you would then obviously need to feed up. But the idea was that it gave you an idea of the controls, as you would expect, in a particular area, rather than the depth and effectiveness of those controls. More, do they exist, and therefore is there something for me to go and look at as I go forward? So still on the syllabus, so therefore we'll still, it's something that we look at. Conducting interviews, and interviews very much part of what we would do. So this is talking about our initial interview really with the client, and set up what we're going to look at around things and content and coverage in the terms of reference. But also there might be one or two others that we talk to. So it might be an area where combining this with number 4, observation, we might decide that we want to go and talk to one or two members of staff, particularly if it's an area that we haven't audited for quite some time and where we can't find any previous audit reports, or it might be where it's a risk-naive area and therefore there isn't a risk register in place. So there are a number of different approaches that we can take there. And really what we're looking at on each of these as we go through is advantages and disadvantages of each one. And that's particularly key as far as that's concerned. Conducting engagements to assure identification of key risks and controls, and so we're making sure that we've got a risk register. We've done all of our preliminary research, and what we're doing is, as we go through, we are identifying any new risks and what controls are in place to address those. So that's quite something that we would do as a normal approach. Okay. I've got another question, but it's something that I'll pick up in a moment. Well, let me finish this bit first, and I'll answer that question. Sampling. And lots of different types of sampling, and you can see the ones, the absolute minimum that we'll cover going through in terms of judgmental or non-statistical, and then statistical sampling, and the various options. We look at discovery sampling, stop and go sampling, and a few of the others as we go forward. Okay. I'm going to leave the King report until a bit further on. So keep asking the questions, and I'll cover those at the end. Okay, so that's your first part. The second bit talks about, as I say, the evidence elements and the different parts of evidence, and that's the syllabus. So the syllabus for this is identify potential sources of evidence. In the International Professional Practices Framework, it does tell you there are 4 key elements of evidence, and actually, interestingly, 3 of those, or 2 of those certainly, are covered within those 4. So our evidence is relevant, sufficient, useful, and trustworthy are the 4 that the standards talk about. So we link that section, the section that we've got here, with what the International Professional Practices Framework says. So if you've read through those performance standards a little bit, then you'll gain the benefit, because you'll already have read through those as we go forward. What are the sources of evidence and the different sources of evidence that we might pick up when we're doing our audit engagement? Well, of course, the key source will be around our testing results. So very, very interested in the different testing results that we have, and how reliable is that evidence? And we talk about physical evidence, things that you can see or touch, being far more reliable than anecdotal evidence where somebody's told us but we are unable to corroborate. We talk about why that's important in terms of our professionalism and our credibility. I'm just turning the page so I can make sure that I've told you the right things as far as that elements are. Yes, so the performance standard talks about must identify sufficient, reliable, relevant and useful information. I change the word reliable there to trustworthy so that I can come up with an acronym called RUST, but you'll have to forgive me for that. So there are our documented audit test results that basically are one of the key sources of that evidence, but it could also be questionnaires. It could be the results of any client surveys that we've done, certainly sources of evidence. It could also be the analytical review that we might have undertaken, where we might have reperformed or reconciled some accounts and budgets. So lots of different sources of evidence, and we'll talk about those on the course. And also, because there is a little bit of a fraud theme going through, we'll talk about a little bit about witness statements if we are doing a fraud investigation. But as you remember in Attribute Standard 1200, proficiency in due professional care, it does talk to us a little bit more about that you need to be aware of the red flags of fraud, and that's what the fraud section talks about, rather than being somebody. Every internal auditor does not have to be a fraud investigator. So we'll pick those up as we go. Okay. Oh, there you are. So the reliable bit is the one that I've changed to trustworthy. I knew it was somewhere. Okay, data analysis and interpretation, and this is talking about CATs, so computer-assisted or computerized audit tools and techniques, and what that might be, and continuous monitoring, for example, which is something that you might have on your IT systems, not necessarily put there by internal audit, but something that managers use to continuously monitor and see how things are working in terms of performance. And we link those a little bit with embedded audit modules, which might be something that we've looked at to make sure that the software that we are running on our systems runs appropriately, and if there are any errors, then there are exception reports produced. If there are changes in different data patterns, it might be that there's an issue, and we can, or management should be looking at those, and we can make sure that they are doing that in that respect. Part 2, conduct spreadsheet analysis. Make me feel every time I read that this syllabus area has been there for a while. Spreadsheets don't hold any mysteries for anybody working in a modern office now. So just some of the things we can do in terms of time monitoring, resource planning, for example, converting data to charts and graphs for presentation in our audit reports. Looking at analytical calculations, creating and running macros. That's the type of thing we'll look at in there. And then the bit which is probably the most significant part in terms of if you are not familiar with some of the terms and what they mean, then this is probably the area where it's worth spending a bit more time. I think they're quite easy. When I say quite easy exam questions to write, I mean from an examiner's perspective. I don't mean they're easy exam questions to answer. But certainly talking about some very basic things like trend analysis, terminology around mean, mode, median, standard deviation, what the normal distribution looks like on a normal bell curve. Now, you probably, if you've been through some financial or statistical training, you probably could even tell me the percentages around the mean. But if not, don't worry, because I use a very simple, everyday example, which I think quite clearly explains some of those as we go. And then part of this as well is as I said, some financial ratios. There are really 3 elements to the financial ratios for CIA. The first is that you know what the ratios are in terms of what the calculation is, and well, yeah, how to perform the calculation. So what is it that the formula looks like, and then what the number means. So for example, if you were looking at liquidity ratios and the current ratio, you know that the formula is current assets divided by current liabilities. You know that the purpose of that ratio shows the potential of the organisation to pay its current liabilities, what it owes, and that the higher the number means that there are more assets available to pay debts. So that's really the 4 elements, I suppose, if you know the name. So that we look at. There are quite a number in the book. I can't remember the number, which I'm a bit disappointed at because I'm a bit of a nerd for numbers. But I pick out 3 liquidity ratios that seem to be quite popular with the examiner: current, quickened, net working capital from memory, and a couple of debt ratios that we look at as well, and then some profitability ratios. I don't get into some of the more technical ones, so we don't in the revision workshop look at earnings before interest and tax, but you will obviously, as part of your revision and preparation for the workshop, and more importantly for the exam, I suppose, will want to learn the ones that are certainly in the book, just in case. Yeah, so we'll look at, as I say, we'll look at some of those in the revision workshop. Documentation and conducting benchmarking. There are some interesting bits on benchmarking. You'll see if you have gone through in the book, there are about 5 or 6 that the Institute identify. Some of those kind of cross borders and sort of sit in different areas as well, but some of the obvious ones like best in class and internal benchmarking, functional benchmarking, and then an industry-wide one as well, and what the definitions are. That's a very popular area for the examiner to ask. You don't need to worry about that at the minute, because I shall be covering that in quite a bit of detail as we go through each part of the syllabus during the revision workshop. And also then around drawing conclusions and what that means, and how we document what we're going to look at, and what it is that we're going to say to the client as we go forward as well. So that's the that part of the syllabus. Oh, there's my financial ratios, what you need to know. There we are. Documentation and working papers, and that's the whole syllabus there. Develop working papers. I always think it's a little bit misleading almost, in terms of the brevity of that syllabus area doesn't necessarily mean I don't need to do any work. What it means is I might need to do a lot of work, because that could, underneath those 2 or 3 words, or those 3 words there, that could mean pretty much anything to do with working papers. So it could be the fact that we should be documenting information as per performance standards that we have, and it could also mean that there are performance standards 2300, which talks about performing the engagement, and within there what it says is that you should be documenting relevant information to support conclusions and engagement results. So we need to make sure that we are clear on the particular performance standards that are relevant. For part 1, it's generally the attribute standards, certainly 2300, which is performing, and 2200, which is planning the engagement. Those ones are very relevant. We talk about risk management, governance and control as well in the syllabus. CIA 1, that's 2100. Kind of gone backwards there, but 2100, 2200, 2300 are very useful. And in develop working papers, we talk about retention requirements, and there are different retention requirements for different papers. How we store it, where we store it, and make sure there are policies in place, and the standards talk about the Chief Audit Executive having those policies in place going forward. There is a bit on current audit working file as well, and on in the last syllabus area, it talked about automated working papers, and well, I picked that up here because I think it gets better when you talk about working papers. So you might use a system that is either a document repository for your internal audit working papers like Galileo. You might use Teammate, which is your time recording, and also you can use some of the core functionality on there to put together your terms of reference or your documentation as you go forward as well. Yeah, so it's quite an interesting area. It's a little bit old-fashioned now, the term current audit file and permanent audit file, but we'll certainly talk about that as well as we go through. Okay. Sorry, I'm just lost my cursor. And the last bit of this one was data reporting, and that's what I was saying at the beginning. So thinking about some of those preliminary conclusions regarding controls. If you've used a system like Galileo, you'll know that it sets it up in that way and talks about how you can how you put together, thinking about your expected or anticipated controls, what that then means as far as different elements of or adequacy of controls. If they're not adequate, that we need to do more work for them, and pick those up as we go through as well. Okay. And reporting test results to auditor in charge is very much around, do we understand the best format to put those in? What are the formats? Are we going to do it in terms of putting together, for example, some kind of control and risk matrix or risk and control matrix? Are we going to have a meeting with the senior auditor or the audit manager, if that's the auditor in charge, an audit memo? We do talk about a little bit about draft report, because some organisations put a draft report together, discuss that as their, in terms of their preliminary findings, so that when they go, even if it's the management action plan at the end, when they go and sit in front of the client, and there is a number of different elements for that as we go forward. So it's quite a it's something that we do. It's just not necessarily something that we might talk about in terms of a separate. It's just part of our audit process, I suppose. It's what I'm trying to say as we go forward. Okay. So there are different types of opinion. The IIA has produced quite a lot of information about audit opinions and what that means and how it should work. So this is one of the elements that it talks about in terms of positive assurance, i.e., not necessarily a good thing for the organisation in terms of it might be a low level of assurance, but positive assurance means that because we've been able to do enough testing, we've identified that there are some, this is the position. So we can be more specific, I suppose, in terms of what we mean and what we can report on. Negative assurance means that we haven't been able to find enough evidence one way or the other from the testing that we've undertaken. So we can't actually say whether it's good, bad, or indifferent in the organisation. Sorry, positive. So not that. Strong, reasonable, limited, or weak, for example, in the organisation, because we haven't been able to. And there might then be a qualified opinion is the other that they talk about in terms of. We found everything was okay apart from. And that can be at engagement level, which is where we're kind of focusing this table here, or it could be at the end of year. So the organisation might receive an overall reasonable or strong level of assurance based on the work that we've looked at in terms of the risk management, governance and control processes. But in an area such as information security, we found that it wasn't as good, and therefore we qualify the overall opinion, or we put a qualification in around that. Or, as I say here, exception of, for example, accounts payable, which requires significant improvement, which might be part of an audit that we do as we go forward as well. And then we make recommendations, and if you don't make recommendations, you do as far as this is concerned, because the IIA's approach talks about making recommendations. And we'll talk about that in terms of reporting results, which is Performance Standard 2400, and then follow-up or monitoring and engagement outcomes, where the word recommendation is used quite regularly. And some of the considerations in terms of the process. So if you've, and I know that when we were talking at in the office in the embankment and on, that there's a varied level of experience. Some might be very new, some might be quite experienced and established in terms of the role of internal audit. We'll make sure that everybody is brought to the same level in terms of what this might mean. And actually the good thing about you all being from the same organisation, if there are things that you're not quite sure how PwC's, what's the approach, because you haven't covered that part of the end-to-end audit process, then it's a good thing where people can share and even point you in the right direction for what your templates or what it looks like from a PwC perspective, which will be very aligned to what the IA would expect you to be doing in any case. Okay. So I'm going to, before I go on to the next steps, I'm just going to have a look at these questions. So I'm not sure. So somebody's asked a question, presume, is Section 3 awareness of proficiency level? I've answered that one, I think. Let me, how do I scroll down? Oh, here we are. Oh, okay. So the one for Arif's been answered. I've got the dates on here anyway. So the difference. Explain the difference on the different versions of the King Report on corporate governance. So they talk about 3 here in the book, which I've just turned to. There is actually a King 4, which was released, as long as you promise not to, and good job this isn't being recorded, December 2016 I'm going to go with. It was late last year, which talked about a number of different elements. I'd say the difference is that there's been a focus in terms of trying to address the specific, where we found there were gaps. Now, so let me just and moving more from the process-driven, this is what you need to do, almost tick box, towards, as King 3 says in your books, more of kind of leadership around things like ethical foundations, the need to look at how we do leadership and control in the organisation, mainly to empower staff to be proactive in terms of if there are issues that they report them and how they do that. King 4 takes it to the next step. It's a really good question because when you're kind of reading through and you don't see, I have got actually some separate slides that I've put together for the IIA for a different course, which is the Qualification Internal Audit Leadership course. But what I'll do is I shall slot those into our discussion when we come to some of the control frameworks. Interestingly, we don't really talk about King particularly in the revision workshop, but I'll make sure that we do for this one in January, and just try to explain how it moved on. So the difference is more about learning the lessons of what they did from King 1, King 2, etc. as they've gone forward, to try and make it more of a working document. In the same way the UK Corporate Governance Code has changed significantly over the last 4 iterations. Sorry, has changed or has been relaunched in the last 4 iterations, but there are still the same 5 elements in terms of the key elements around the UK Corporate Governance Code, the same way that COSO is irregularly updated, but it's mainly to try and look at some of the key learnings rather than introducing something brand new. Yeah, okay. I don't know if I've really explained that very well, so I would just say it's an updated version reflecting the latest business and landscape in South Africa, rather than a fundamental rewrite. There are a large number of principles that organisations had to go through, and they've tried to reduce those over the years. But I'm sure that in King 4 there were 75 still, which sounds like a huge amount of admin to be able to pick that up. So I'm sorry that if I haven't really answered that, but I've had a go. It's a good question though, it's an interesting question. So, okay, so I'm just moving now. So Arif's got, when is the revision workshop? As you've seen here, the revision workshop that you're having is on the 10th and 11th of January. There is, so it's a 2-day revision workshop. Before that, obviously, your next steps are study. And then there's a Q&A session that I'm doing on the afternoon of the 12th, which I'm going to stay in London and come and do in person rather than do it on the WebEx. And I think Jan understands a little bit more about what's happening for the first bit. So when I'll pass over to him in a moment. I'm just going to look through it. So revision workshop, Jan's put 10th, 11th of January as per my slide, and then my open Q&A session. And then I've got a question there from Arif, which is, what do you mean by awareness? How deep do we need to learn? I don't know if you know Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a learning theorem that's been around for quite a number of years now. It talks about knowledge and comprehension as the first two steps, followed by application and then analysis, and then evaluation and synthesis. So really awareness from the IA's perspective is very much around knowing what we mean in terms of the theory, and then being able to, and then understanding it and being in a position to be able to answer questions around that. Means things like being able to define key terms, being able to recall facts about the issues, I think is the wording that is used. So define key terms, recall facts about the issues. Proficiency, understanding and applying the subject matter. So for proficiency you need awareness, and then after that you will need to be able to apply that. So in the workplace it says on a regular basis. As per a multiple choice exam, what that means is it's more likely to be an area where you've got a scenario of 2 or 3 lines that you will then, and then 4 options for answers, and then you will apply your knowledge, understanding, and being able to apply that to the scenario and answer the question correctly, obviously. The analysis part often picks up things like where you might have to do a calculation. So you may do a calculation in terms of the financial ratios or trend analysis, bell curve, for example. So I hope that's answered that question. So I'm just going back here in terms of awareness. So it's recalling facts, defining terms, and proficiency, being able to apply that to the questions. I've got a question here that says, do we need to learn the reference to the standard for proficiency? No, but you need to learn the standard for proficiency. So if you think of the attribute standards, it depends how you remember things. So if you can just remember in order what the 4 standards are, because they sort of build, certainly on the attribute standards. I just think it's easy if you think of it as 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, and 1,000 is purpose, authority and responsibility, 1,100 is independence and objectivity, 1,200 is proficiency and due professional care, and 1,300 is quality assurance and improvement program. But if you remember those without the numbers, that's fine. You won't get asked which, where is this statement from, and have to identify the number. I just think it's, certainly for me, it makes it easier to read. And I'm getting on a bit, so if I can remember it from the numbers, then you probably can as well. And Arif asked as well, do we need to learn the standard wording as well? It's certainly quite helpful to know that. I wouldn't be learning each of the standards in terms of a word for word recall, because section 1 of part 1, which is where the mandatory guidance and where the standards sit, do talk about proficiency. So you'll need to know what the main thrust of each of those is. So as you read through the IPPF, the International Professional Practice Framework, you'll see that there is for attribute standard 1000, or for the first attribute standard, performance, purpose, authority and responsibility. What the standard really is talking about is that you should have an audit charter, and within the audit charter, the purpose, the authority and the responsibility of the audit function should be clearly defined, and then that should be approved regularly by the audit committee. That's our access all areas and access all people card. So if you that's the point of it. And what do we mean by purpose, authority and responsibility? What's the purpose of internal audit? Well, actually the purpose of internal audit, you could probably say, is the mission, as well as combined with the definition. So you could explain to me that the purpose of internal audit is to enhance and protect organisational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance and advice and insights, as well as the definition. The authority is about our access. The responsibility is around what we do and don't do. So we provide assurance over risk management, control and governance processes. But one of the things we don't do, if I picked out risk management, is we don't set the risk appetite, and we don't manage the risk management process for the organisation. So they link together. So certainly the first, the headings that I've mentioned. So for the proficiency one, which Arif mentioned as an example, yes, it's useful to know that there is an attribute standard that talks about proficiency in due professional care. We'll go through what they mean for an internal audit unit in terms of it's about have we got the right levels of skills, abilities, etc., specialisms if we need them. It's about coaching, mentoring. It's about CPD, training, learning and development, and all those things as well. So there are quite a number of different elements to it that we will talk about and try and pull together at the revision workshop. So that's what to expect. Just the, oh yeah, learn. Yeah, I got learn. There should be, so I had this question about where the standards are written down together in one place that we have access to. There is the International Professional Practice Framework. If you go on to the IIA's website, through which you access your, what am I thinking of? Your access to the CIA Student Hub. But if you go onto the home page of the Chartered Institute of Internal Audit's website, you log in because you'll need to log in to be able to do it. And then there is it talks about My Basket and Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and then a search function. Underneath there, there's a menu bar across the top. If you click on Resources, that will take you to global. Sorry, on the left-hand side, that will take you to a list of things that you can access. And on the left-hand side, you will see, third down from the top, is IPPF. So within there, you've got everything, and you can download a version of the IPPF. And it is a PDF version, I'm sure. Still, I'm just scrolling down to look. Yes, download the full IPPF at the bottom. Content, so 34 pages. So you can download that, and I would recommend that you all download that, and that you read that, and that you bring that with you, and that's that you will take you'll take with you. Okay, take you with you everywhere is what I mean. Okay, so I'm just going down these questions. Awareness we've done, proficiency, standard wording, IPPF. Oh, Jan's put on a link. Isn't he clever? It probably wasn't Jan. It was probably somebody who works for Jan, because I know in the book is a specific e.g. code of ethics and internal audit charter. In the book is there a specific, do we need to have an understanding of these as well? No, I would say for example, it's useful to look at code of ethics, but the code of ethics that you need to know. I've just got the book here in front of me, so I'm just going to see what's actually in the book. That what you need from a aspect in terms of code of ethics is what the IAA say, and what the IAA say. Let me just have a look. 20. Yeah. So the IAA's code of ethics adopted by the board. What you've got there, the principles of that's just listed from the International Professional Practice Framework. The rules of conduct is what I was talking about as being very nice for the examiner, because you can put down there and you could mix those up and make it a question. For example, which of the following rules of conduct sit under integrity, and you could mix and match them there. So what you'll find is that extract, to answer the question specifically, on page 21 of your book is very much lifted from the IPPF. But if you're going to read that, because this book was 2013 and there's been a few slight tweaks to wording, slight changes to wording in the latest version, I would just read it through the International Professional Practice Framework, which is the most up to date. But on page 23 it then talks about, you know, some of the 4 areas. So it's about you know, which of the what do each of the 4 mean, but then what the rules of conduct are is particularly useful. In terms of an audit charter, audit charters are very personal to and specific to organisations. Because, for example, in my organisation, I might not have the capacity to do any consulting activity, and therefore it will say quite clearly in my audit charter that I will only do assurance work, because there might be a small number of people. In an organisation like PricewaterhouseCoopers, of course, you'll do huge amounts of assurance work, and you will also provide consulting activity as well. We'll talk about the differences and how that works as we go forward. We will also talk about the key elements of what goes into an audit charter: purpose, authority of responsibility, statement of independence in terms of, you know, where we sit in terms of our functional and administrative reporting, as well as the scope of what it is that we're going to do, which is what I've just alluded to with my assurance versus consultancy discussion there. So that's fine. Function and responsibility statement and statement of policy. I presume that's something in the book, Arif, so I'm not quite sure where that sits. Is that my last question? Can you give me an indication of where that sits in terms of the book? Oh, I see. You're going through some of the bits on mandatory guidance. Again, some of these other key documents that you might have in the organisation, that's really what this page is talking about, and I'm just looking at page 29. So it might be something that you don't have. This is really the F&R statement is really about what staff I've got and what they're responsible for as far as delivering different, often specialisms in the organisation, and how that might work. And the statement of policy is really more of an overarching. This is what we're going to try and achieve. What you often see is that there will be an audit charter which might have 1 or 2 links or appendices, like hyperlinks to other documents. I would say that there is a really good chance that an F&R statement is something that you won't come across. I think I've seen one, and that's when I was doing some consulting work for an American firm. But certainly the audit manual, which is also listed there, and staff job descriptions is very much areas that we would look at. And the audit manual will talk about when it talks about developed work papers as one of the syllabus areas. Certainly, that's where it's an area that you would expect your audit process, for example, to be in your working papers. They often talk about, for audit manuals, that there are 3 elements. One is the the organisational structure and the setup, and I suppose picks up the elements in terms of the statement of policy. One is the purely admin side, so that's about how you claim expenses and how you claim how you get authorised for different types of travel, how you put a timesheet in, and then the middle bit is really the core area, which is very much around we are doing audits in this particular way. I've just seen your page 31 as well, so yeah. So I hope I've answered that. I don't know whether I have. You can answer me if you like. Just scrolling down again. Okay, so difference between, I think I've done that one, so page 31. What is the role of subcontractor in internal audit? How is that different to outsourcing? Let me look at the specifics of the wording. I seem to have a slightly, yeah, okay, so it's really how it's different to outsourcing. Well, it's different. It's closer to co-sourcing. It's something really where it's, I'd say, it's a subset of co-sourcing. Co-sourcing is where I need a particular skills, and I remember when I worked for Department for Work and Pensions, we had a call-off contract with PwC for IT audit expertise. But more IT expertise in terms of some of the systems that we had. So we didn't have anybody who understood C++ programming, so we pulled somebody in, and that was classed as co-sourcing. Subcontracted, and it's subcontracting, and I'm looking at it here, but that's really for, again, it's an element of that, but it would be for part, whereas co-sourcing is bringing somebody in to do the audit with you, and sometimes for you. Subcontracting is just a different way of doing it, and it's generally for an element of the audit. I wouldn't be too concerned about subcontracting. I'm not particularly. Can't remember anybody ever saying that there was a question asked on that, but it's a valid question. So outsourcing really, from the IA's perspective, is somebody from outside does everything, and what you might just retain within the organisation is a contract management function, really, or some kind of function in that respect. There is a huge, but there is the continuum, and we'll talk about the continuum of sourcing internal audit and the advantages and disadvantages within each one. And if there are some issues still on that terminology at the revision workshop, we can pick those up as well.
Gary, just I quickly want to talk about the difference between outsourcing and subcontracting. Outsourcing is generally regarded as an area within the organization that is given to another organization. So, for example, there's no reason why internal audit cannot be part of any organization, whether it's outsourced or not. Subcontracting is usually a very specific task. For example, if you think of cleaning up a brownfield land, cleaning the soil, making it stable again to build houses. That is a very specific task. So, and that is the type of thing that will then be subcontracted. So, is that clear? Do you understand the difference? I hope I do. I hope I came across clearly. Gary, do that make sense?
Oh, perfect.
Thank you. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So, are there any other questions? Oh, it totally makes sense. Oh, good. There we are. I'm not sure whether Arif's talking about you, Jan. It's more likely to be talking about what I said, I think.
I wouldn't doubt that for a second.
So, I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions. Oh, both. Thank you. Very politically correct. Yes. So in terms of next steps then, so obviously you're doing your studying, we're doing the revision workshop. Yeah, and on the 12th of January, the day after the revision, in the morning, yeah. Do you know what they're doing in the morning?
In the morning you will be able to work with the fellow candidates, with your colleagues, go through the work that Gary has been doing with you on the revision workshop. Then you will be getting the opportunity to do a practice exam, lucky you, and then that afternoon you will have your Q&A with Gary again.
So my current understanding is I'm coming in about 2 o'clock to, do we know where the revision workshop is going to be held yet, Jan?
It hasn't been confirmed, but it's so far it's near Watford. Lassiter House, something like that. I will send you the details, and I'll add it to the hub when it is confirmed. But so far, it hasn't been confirmed, but it will probably be. I think it's called Latimer House. It's just outside Watford.
Okay. It sounds nice already, doesn't it? Oh, it's a De Vere place.
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. Super.
And if anybody needs any help with anything, there will be somebody from the IAA there both days for the revision workshop, and probably the morning of the 12th as well. So if you need anything, we'll also be hanging around.
Can I choose who that is?
No.
Okay. So that you'll have the mock exam and the working together in the morning, and then I'll be there for about 2 o'clock, from 2 till 4, if there are any questions at that point. And then the only thing left after that will be to pass the exam, of course. So,
Gary, I just want to confirm, are you available live, or is it going to be an online session on the 12th?
I'm happy to stay there.
Great, thank you very much.
Especially if it's a De Vere place, I'll go to the leisure facilities, and while everybody else is doing the exam, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
That's all about the perks.
Yeah. Okay, so I haven't got anything else to say, so I don't know if there's going to be any more questions. It is. I don't know how. I would just say about. There is, of course, the Student Hub, which I'm hoping that people are finding quite useful. I'm sure that as you're going through different elements, your fellow students, colleagues can discuss any issues with you. But if there are any questions that you want to ask either of Jan or myself, then please put something on the discussion forum. That'd be really, really good. And you'll find quite a lot on there in terms of the slide deck that we had last time and the mock-up, as well as various other elements. I'm just looking, and in fact it's got loads of details and information on there that you'll find useful. Okay.
Okay, it looks as if we're kind of wrapped up then pretty early. Just thank you again to Gary for doing this. To the candidates, if you have any issues, please do not hesitate to contact us, learning@ia.org.uk. And then Gary has also shared ways for you to get in touch with him. Also on the PwC Hub, there is also a discussion forum where you can put down your own ideas and liaise with your fellow students. If there are no other questions, then I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.